We see the world through stories, through films, books, headlines, photographs, memories, and myths. But every story has another layer, one that's often forgotten, overlooked, or deliberately left out. Welcome to Behind the Curtain. Let's take a closer look. Some stories don't hide in forgotten archives or unsolved case files. They hide behind masterpieces. In the books we celebrate, the albums we admire, the films we all call classics. We remember the finished work, we rarely ask what it took to create it. At first glance, today's story is about one of the greatest war films ever made. In reality, it's about a production that became almost as chaotic as the war it was trying to portray. In 1971, audiences watched a patrol boat travel deeper and deeper into the Vietnamese jungle. The mission seemed simple: travel upriver, find Colonel Walter Kurtz, terminate his command. The further the boat traveled, the stranger the world became. Discipline dissolved, reality blurred, civilization slowly disappeared. By the time Captain Willard reached Kurtz, it felt less like a military operation and more like a descent into madness. The remarkable thing is, exactly the same thing was happening behind the camera. Few films have generated as many stories about their production as Apocalypse Now. Actors suffering breakdowns, sets destroyed by a typhoon, helicopters disappearing in the middle of filming because they were suddenly needed in an actual war, a leading actor having a heart attack, another arriving weeks late without reading the script, a director privately convinced he was either making the greatest film in history or destroying his life. Almost every one of those stories is true. Today, Apocalypse Now is regarded as one of cinema's defining achievements. It shared the Palme d'Or at Cannes, received 8 Academy Award nominations, inspired generations of filmmakers including Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, and Werner Herzog. Its images have become part of popular culture: helicopters sweeping across the horizon, napalm exploding beneath Wagner, Colonel Kurtz emerging slowly from darkness. It's difficult to imagine film history without it. It's equally difficult to imagine another production surviving the way it was made. The question isn't whether the film became a masterpiece. Few people still argue about that. The question is something much more uncomfortable. Could the masterpiece have existed without the disaster? Why did Francis Ford Coppola choose Heart of Darkness? Because for decades, filmmakers believed it couldn't be adapted. Joseph Conrad's novella isn't driven by action. Very little actually happens. A man travels upriver searching for another man. That's the plot. What made the novel extraordinary wasn't the journey, it was what the journey represented. Published in 1899, Heart of Darkness was one of the earliest major works to challenge the idea that European colonialism was a civilizing force. Conrad had traveled through the Congo Free State himself and witnessed the brutal exploitation that lay beneath the language of empire. His novel stripped away the comforting illusion that civilization and morality always travel together. At its center stands Kurtz, a brilliant, educated European who leaves civilization behind and slowly becomes something else entirely. Not simply cruel, not insane, something more unsettling. Someone who discovers that once every social rule disappears, human beings are capable of almost anything. That idea lingered for decades. Then came Vietnam. By the late 1960s, America found itself fighting a war that increasingly seemed impossible to explain in moral terms. Images of burning villages, civilian casualties, and televised combat reached living rooms every evening. The gap between official rhetoric and public reality grew wider every year. Screenwriter John Milius immediately recognized the parallel. The Congo could become Vietnam, the river could become the Mekong, the colonial expedition could become an American military mission. The destination remained exactly the same: a man traveling towards another man who had crossed a line from which there was no return. Suddenly, a 70-year-old novella no longer felt historical, it felt contemporary. The story begins nearly 80 years before the cameras rolled. In 1899, Joseph Conrad published Heart of Darkness. On the surface, it's a story about a river journey into the Belgian Congo. Beneath that, it's an exploration of power. colonialism, isolation, and what remains of a person when every social restraint disappears. Its central figure, Kurtz, is not simply a villain. He represents someone who has traveled so far beyond conventional morality that ordinary language can no longer describe him. For decades, filmmakers considered adapting Conrad's novel. Most concluded it couldn't be done. To understand why Apocalypse Now was even possible, you have to understand Hollywood in the 1970s. The old studio system was collapsing. For decades, major studios covered almost every aspect of filmmaking. Directors were employees. Producers made the important decisions. Financial risk was carefully managed. Then, audiences changed. Young Americans stopped watching the kinds of films Hollywood had spent decades producing. At the same time, a new generation of directors emerged. Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Brian De Palma, William Friedkin, and Francis Ford Coppola. Instead of executives shaping films, directors increasingly became the creative center of the industry. It became known as New Hollywood. For a brief period, studios were willing to take extraordinary risks on ambitious young filmmakers because those risks were working. The Godfather, Taxi Driver, Jaws, The Exorcist. These weren't simply successful films, they reshaped American cinema. No director embodied that confidence more than Coppola. After making The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2, he wasn't merely successful. He was regarded as one of the greatest filmmakers alive. That reputation gave him something almost no director has enjoyed before or since: the freedom to attempt something everyone else considered impossible. When Francis Ford Coppola joined the project, he wasn't simply one of Hollywood's most successful directors. Most directors would have accepted studio financing, worked within established systems, protected themselves financially. Coppola did the opposite. He mortgaged much of his own future, placed his production company at enormous risk, and effectively bet his career on a single film. If Apocalypse Now failed, it wouldn't simply damage his reputation, it could bankrupt him. Principal photography began in the Philippines in March 1976. The location had been chosen partially because it resembled Vietnam. It also offered something Hollywood couldn't: the cooperation of the Philippine military, helicopters, pilots, equipment, entire military units. Everything seemed to be falling into place, at least for a while, because almost immediately everything started going wrong. One obvious question remains: if Apocalypse Now is about Vietnam, why wasn't it filmed there? The answer was straightforward. The Vietnam War had only recently ended. Filming inside Vietnam was politically impossible. Instead, Coppola chose the Philippines. The landscape closely resembled large parts of Vietnam: dense jungle, wide rivers, remote villages. Just as importantly, the Philippine government agreed to support the production. President Ferdinand Marcos authorized the use of military helicopters, pilots, and equipment. For a Hollywood production, it seemed like an extraordinary opportunity. It soon became an extraordinary complication, because those helicopters weren't props. They belonged to an active military. Whenever fighting intensified elsewhere in the country, the aircraft simply left. Crew members would prepare an elaborate aerial sequence involving dozens of helicopters. The cameras would be ready, actors in position, explosions prepared. Then someone would receive a radio message: the helicopters had been recalled. Not because filming had changed, because the real war had interrupted the fictional one. Few productions have ever depended so directly on events unfolding beyond the film itself. The first major crisis wasn't weather, it was casting. Originally, Captain Benjamin Willard was played by Harvey Keitel. For several weeks, Coppola filmed with him in the role. The footage no longer survives publicly in its entirety, but enough has been seen over the years to understand what happened. Keitel wasn't giving a bad performance, he was giving the wrong one. His Willard was active, confrontational, always pushing outward. Coppola wanted the opposite: a man who seemed to absorb the madness around him rather than react to it. Someone almost emotionally empty, a witness, not a hero. After weeks of filming, Coppola made one of the most expensive decisions of his career. He fired his lead actor. Entire sections of the film had to be abandoned. Production stopped. Everything would have to be filmed again. The replacement was Martin Sheen. Looking back, it's almost impossible to imagine anyone else playing Willard. But at the time, Sheen arrived exhausted. He had been working constantly, he was drinking heavily. The production itself was already beginning to spiral. Long days, oppressive heat, constant rewrites, no completed ending. A director whose ambition seemed to expand faster than the schedule could contain them. Everyone felt the pressure, no one more than she. One of the very first scenes filmed became one of the most famous in the movie. Willard alone in a Saigon hotel room, drunk, sweating, punching a mirror, collapsing onto the floor. It feels almost documentary like, because in many ways it is. The sequence began as acting. As filming continued, Sheen became increasingly intoxicated. He insisted the cameras keep rolling. The punch through the mirror wasn't planned. The blood was real. Crew members moved to stop the scene. Coppola didn't. The footage remained in the film. Today, it's almost impossible to separate performance from reality. The actor was portraying a man falling apart, while beginning to fall apart himself. Only days later, the situation became far more serious. In March 1977, Martin Sheen suffered a heart attack. He was just 36 years old. Production stopped immediately. For weeks, no one knew whether the film could continue. Insurance companies had to be managed carefully. Schedules rewritten, scenes abandoned. Some shots were completed using Sheen's brother, Joe Estevez, as the body double. Others were simply postponed while the actor recovered. Every additional day cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. By now, the production had drifted dramatically beyond both its schedule and its budget. Most directors facing this situation would have simplified the film, reduced scenes, cut expensive sequences, finished as quickly as possible. Francis Ford Coppola did the opposite. He kept expanding, rewriting, experimenting, searching. It was becoming increasingly obvious that Apocalypse Now wasn't following a finished screenplay. It was discovering itself while it was being filmed. Then came perhaps the greatest gamble of all, Marlon Brando. Even before arriving in the Philippines, Brando was already one of the most famous actors in the world. His performances in A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and The Godfather had transformed modern acting. His reputation, however, had become almost as legendary as his talent. He was unpredictable, difficult, often arrived unprepared. Studios accepted these problems because occasionally he produced brilliance. Coppola hoped Apocalypse Now would be one of those occasions. Instead, Brando arrived several weeks late. He hadn't read Heart of Darkness, he hadn't read the screenplay, and he was dramatically heavier than anyone expected. The script described Colonel Kurtz as a lean, almost skeletal soldier, hardened by years in the jungle. The man stepping off the plane looked nothing like that. For a moment, it appeared the film might simply collapse. Most directors would have rewritten the role or replaced the actor. Coppola couldn't do either. Brando had been paid approximately $3.5 million, dollars, the highest salary any actor had received up to that point. More importantly, the entire production had been sold to financiers on the promise that Marlon Brando would appear in the film. There was no alternative, so Coppola did something far more interesting. Instead of changing Brando, he changed Kurtz. The script described a military officer. The finished film presents something closer to mythology. Brando is rarely shown in full light. His head emerges slowly from the darkness. His face appears in fragments, a hand, a silhouette, a whisper. The audience spends most of the film imagining Kurtz before fully seeing him. What began as a practical solution to hide Brando's appearance became one of the film's defining visual ideas. Sometimes limitations don't weaken art, they create it. Then came another problem. Brando still hadn't read the screenplay. Crew members later recalled long conversations in which Coppola tried to explain the story, while Brando questioned almost every assumption behind it. Who was Kurtz? Why had he abandoned the army? What kind of man would willingly become a god in the jungle? The discussion lasted for hours. Fortunately, Brando was doing what Brando often did best, thinking out loud. Many of Kurt's most memorable monologues weren't performed exactly as written. They emerged from conversations, fragments, improvisations, philosophical debates between actor and director. Brando spoke about war, about morality, about civilization, about what happens when violence stops pretending to be civilized. Coppola listened, rewrote, adapted. The script continued evolving even while cameras were rolling. Watching those scenes today, it's difficult to imagine them being delivered any other way. The uncertainty became part of Kurtz himself. He doesn't sound like someone reciting dialogue, he sounds like someone discovering terrible truth while speaking them. If Brando represented the mysterious center of Kurtz's kingdom, Dennis Hopper represented everything orbiting around it. Hopper played the unnamed American photojournalist who worships Kurtz with almost religious devotion. Hyperactive, paranoid, constantly talking. He feels like someone who has spent too long inside Kurtz's world. The performance is unforgettable because it seems almost impossible to control. According to several members of the production, that wasn't entirely an illusion. Hopper arrived with his own personal struggles and an improvisational style that perfectly matched the increasingly chaotic atmosphere surrounding the production. Rather than resisting it, Coppola embraced it. The character became less scripted, more spontaneous, more unpredictable. Watching those scenes today, it's difficult to separate Hopper's performance from the atmosphere in which it was created. The deeper Willard travels to Kurtz's compound, the less the film feels traditionally acted. It begins to feel observed, almost documentary like. Every person inhabiting Kurt's world seems transformed by proximity to him. The audience experiences that transformation alongside Willard. Then nature intervened. In May 1976, Typhoon Olga struck the Philippines. Entire villages were damaged, roads disappeared, and the elaborate jungle sets built for Apocalypse Now were devastated. Months of construction vanished in days. Buildings collapsed, crops scattered across flooded landscapes. Millions of dollars disappeared overnight. Production stopped once again. For weeks, cast and crew waited while enormous sections of the film were rebuilt from scratch. Every delay pushed the budget higher. Every delay increased the pressure. Every delay made finishing the film seem slightly less likely. As if that weren't enough, the production faced another problem no Hollywood studio had ever seriously planned for. The helicopters weren't actually movie helicopters, but belonged to the Philippine Air Force. And while President Ferdinand had agreed to make them available for filming, there was one condition. If fighting intensified elsewhere in the country, the helicopters would leave immediately, and they did. Entire shooting schedules became impossible to predict. Remarkably, Coppola adapted. Rather than waiting for ideal conditions, he began embracing uncertainty. Scenes changed according to the helicopters available. Camera positions became more improvisational. Action became less choreographed. Looking back, many film historians argue that this unpredictability contributed directly to the extraordinary energy of the helicopter attack sequence. It doesn't feel perfectly controlled, it feels chaotic because it was. The film wasn't imitating disorder, it was being created inside it. At this point, Apocalypse Now had become something almost no studio would tolerate today. It was dramatically over budget, months behind schedule. The lead actor had suffered a heart attack, and sets had been destroyed. Its ending still hadn't been written, and its director was beginning to question whether he was capable of finishing the film at all. When principal photography finally ended, many people assumed the hardest part was over. In reality, the film still didn't exist. Coppola had returned from the Philippines with hundreds of hours of footage, multiple versions of scenes, improvised dialogue, alternative storylines, an ending that continued to evolve. The challenge wasn't assembling a film, it was discovering what film had actually been made. That responsibility fell largely to editor and sound designer Walter Murch. Today, Murch is regarded as one of the greatest editors in cinema history, but Apocalypse Now remains perhaps his most extraordinary achievement. Editing is often misunderstood. People imagine it as cutting away unwanted material. In reality, editing is where rhythm, tension, and meaning are created. It's where individual scenes become a story. For Apocalypse Now, that process bordered on archaeological excavation. Every reel contained possibilities. Some sequences were shortened dramatically, others disappeared entirely, still others were completely restructured. The famous rhythm of the river journey, the gradual descent into increasingly surreal encounters, wasn't discovered in the jungle. It was discovered in the edit suit. Many filmmakers have since argued that Apocalypse Now was effectively written three times, first by John Milius, then by Francis Ford Coppola during production, and finally by Walter Murch in the post production. Without any one of those three versions, the film we know today simply wouldn't exist. Fortunately for history, someone was recording everything. Throughout production, Eleanor Coppola carried a camera. Initially, it wasn't intended as a documentary, it was a personal record. Letters home, conversations, fragments of daily life on an impossibly difficult film set. She interviewed crew members, filmed rehearsals, captured Francis alone after difficult days. What she preserved wasn't the making of a movie, it was the gradual psychological collapse of production. Years later, that footage became Hearts of Darkness, a filmmaker's apocalypse. Today, it's widely regarded as one of the greatest documentaries ever made about filmmaking, not because it celebrates success, because it refuses to hide failure. There's one sequence in particular that has become legendary. Francis Coppola sits alone, speaking directly into Eleanor's recorder. He isn't giving an interview, he's thinking out loud. He wonders whether the film will destroy him financially, whether he'll lose his house, whether he'll lose everything he spent years building. At another moment, he says something extraordinary. My film is not about Vietnam. It is Vietnam. He continues, we were in the jungle. There were too many of us. We had access to too much money, too much equipment, and little by little we went insane. It's one of the most honest things any major filmmaker has ever admitted while still making the film itself, and perhaps the most revealing because Coppola had stopped thinking of the production and the story as separate events. They had become the same experience. That's what makes Apocalypse Now unique. Most war films simulate chaos. This one absorbed it. Willard travels deeper into psychological darkness. So does the director. The screenplay keeps changing, reality keeps changing faster. The production begins to mirror its own narrative. No one planned that, no one could have. Yet somehow the parallel becomes impossible to ignore. Willard doesn't know what he'll find at the end of the river. For much of production, neither did Coppola. When Apocalypse Now premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 1979, it wasn't actually finished. Coppola famously described it as a work in progress. He continued editing after Cannes. Even after its theatrical release, he never entirely stopped. In 2001, he released Apocalypse Now Redo, restoring nearly 50 minutes of footage. In 2019 came the final cut, another substantial revision. Unlike most classics, Apocalypse Now doesn't really have a single definitive version. It exists as a series of evolving interpretations by the man who made it. Even decades later, Coppola was still asking the same question he had asked in The Jungle. What is this film actually trying to become? Looking back on 2026, the conversation surrounding Apocalypse Now has changed. For years, people asked whether the suffering had been worth it, whether masterpieces required obsession, whether artistic genius justified impossible working conditions. Increasingly, film historians ask a different question. Why was any of it considered acceptable? Today, productions employ mental health coordinators, safety supervisors, intimacy coordinators, stricter insurance oversight, far greater accountability for working conditions. The industry hasn't eliminated abuse or exhaustion, but it increasingly recognizes that extraordinary art shouldn't require extraordinary harm. That shift changes how we view Apocalypse Now, not as a model to imitate, but as a document from the end of a very different era. None of this diminishes the achievement. If anything, it makes it more complicated. The suffering was real. Martin Sheen's heart attack was real. The financial risk was real. The psychological strain on cast and crew was real. The masterpiece may also be real. Those truths don't cancel each other out, they exist together. And that's what makes this story so difficult. We often like our history to be simple great art born from genius, or great art born from exploitation. Apocalypse Now refuses to fit either version. It was ambition, luck, improvisation, brilliance, exhaustion, disaster, persistence, all at once. Perhaps that's why the film still feels alive nearly half a century later. Not because it depicts madness, because traces of that madness remain embedded within it. Every frame carries the weight of impossible decisions. Every scene reflects a production that kept surviving. Every scene reflects a production that kept surviving problems that should have ended it. The journey upriver wasn't only Willard's. It belonged to everyone making the film. Apocalypse Now is often remembered as one of the greatest war films ever made. Perhaps it is something even stranger, a documentary about its own creation disguised as fiction. Every story leaves something outside the frame. Sometimes it's a forgotten person, sometimes it's a missing chapter, and sometimes it's the part that changes how we understand everything else. If this story surprised you, imagine how many others are still waiting to be discovered. Until next time, stay curious.